There is a throne in the darkness beneath the world, and on that throne sits a god who cannot speak. He has been there for over 10,000 years, sealed inside a machine so vast and so ancient that even the priests who tend it no longer truly understand what it does. His body is not a body anymore, not really. It is a ruin wrapped in gold, flesh that has been rotting for 100 centuries, kept hovering at the very edge of death by machinery and sacrifice, and the sheer, crushing weight of human faith pressing against reality itself. Every single day, 1,000 psychically gifted human beings are brought before him in secret, and their life force is consumed, their souls fed into that terrible machine, like kindling thrown into a furnace, pouring their brief existence into a flame that would otherwise go dark. And the moment that flame goes dark, the Imperium of mankind ends. Not eventually, immediately. Within hours, the beacon that guides every starship through the treacherous currents of warp space would flicker out, and every single vessel currently navigating the Imperium would be lost in the dark forever, spinning into the hungry void without any hope of finding their way home. His name is the Emperor of Mankind. Some call him the God Emperor. Others call him the corpse on the throne. His enemies, the servants of chaos who have tried and failed to destroy everything he built, call him the anathema, a word that means the thing most fundamentally opposed to their own existence. He was, by any measure that has any meaning, the most powerful being humanity ever produced, a warrior and statesman and psychic of unimaginable strength, who had spent all of recorded history slowly guiding his species toward a greatness that the vast majority of people alive in the 41st millennium cannot even conceptualize. He built an empire spanning the stars. He created sons from his own genetic material who could have remade the galaxy in his image. He had a vision of humanity that was genuinely hopeful, genuinely beautiful, genuinely ambitious, in ways that no civilization before or since has attempted. And then, everything fell apart, as it so often does, in fire and treachery and loss beyond measure. Now the question that haunts every corner of the lore, every fan theory, every whispered hope passed between people who love this universe, is this. What happens if he comes back? Not if the machines fail, not if his body finally crumbles to dust, and the daemons pour through the breach beneath the mountain. What happens if the Emperor of Mankind, against all odds and all expectation, against the calculations of every theologian and the fears of every political institution that has grown fat and comfortable in his absence, actually returns? The answer is that everything changes. Absolutely everything. And the signs, if you know where to look, suggest that something is already happening beneath the surface of the lore, something that has been building for years of real time and decades of in-universe narrative, something that the most recent developments, the return of Primarchs, the opening of the Great Rift, the breakdown of the old stasis that defined the setting for so long, are all pointing toward like arrows drawn back on a bow. This is the story of what might be coming, and it is one of the most extraordinary things in all of science fiction. Number, Part 1. The God on the Golden Throne. To understand what his return would mean, you first have to understand what he actually is, not what the ecclesiarchy says he is, not the sanitized propaganda version carved into the walls of 1 billion cathedrals across 1 million worlds, the triumphant golden figure with the blazing eyes and the outstretched arms, welcoming the faithful into his grace. You have to understand the real thing, the actual history, buried under 10,000 years of doctrine and dogma and deliberate mystification. The Emperor was not born in the 41st millennium. He was not even born in the 31st. According to the lore that stretches back into the deepest reaches of Black Library fiction, the being who would become the Emperor was born approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era, in a region we would recognize today as Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. He was born, the texts suggest, from the collective sacrifice of hundreds of shamans, psychic seers who had lived and died across the entire length of human prehistory, who understood that the warp, the psychic dimension that mirrors our own material reality, was beginning to coalesce into something extraordinarily dangerous. The entities that would become gods were gathering strength. The chaos gods were not yet fully formed, not yet the overwhelming powers they would become, but they were growing, feeding on the collective psychic output of a species that had been generating suffering and ambition and love and cruelty for thousands of generations. These shamans saw what was coming, and they understood that something would need to stand against it. So they poured everything they were into a single new soul. They burned themselves out, willingly, in one of the most extraordinary acts of collective sacrifice in the setting's mythology, to create something that could stand against the darkness that was forming. He grew up as a mortal man, more or less. He learned what humanity was by living through its entire history. He was there, in one body or another, reborn through his perpetual nature, across the whole stretch of civilization. He saw the rise of city-states along river valleys and watched them grow into empires. He walked through the ages of bronze and iron and, eventually, silicon. He witnessed the flowering of philosophy in ancient Greece and the burning of libraries in Alexandria. He moved through plagues and wars and the slow, grinding machine of recorded history, and he watched his species nearly destroy itself a dozen times over, and he understood the pattern of it, the way that the same mistakes recurred, because the same impulses recurred, the way that no amount of wisdom in one generation could guarantee that the next would not have to learn the same lessons in blood. Through all of it, he was preparing, accumulating knowledge and power and understanding at a pace that no ordinary human mind could sustain. He had the advantage, if you can call it that, of being able to watch without having to personally bear the weight of a normal human life's worth of grief. He could mourn and move on in ways that mortal beings cannot. He could learn from catastrophes rather than being destroyed by them. And across those thousands of years, he developed a plan, the word that matters most in understanding who and what he is: perpetual. This is a specific and significant piece of lore that the Black Library has slowly and carefully developed across the Horus Heresy novel series. Perpetuals are humans born with a unique quality, something woven into the very structure of their soul that causes them to regenerate after death. Not like ordinary healing. Not like the extraordinary physiology of a space marine who can survive wounds that would kill any ordinary person 10 times over. A perpetual can be killed completely, reduced to ash and scatter, and will eventually return. Their body rebuilds. Their consciousness persists across the gap of death. They come back, each time carrying everything they were before. There have been other perpetuals in the lore. Alanius Pius, the old soldier who stood between Horus and the dying emperor, with nothing but a lasgun and 10,000 years of stubbornness, is one of the most famous. Vulcan, the primarch of the salamanders, is another, his power to return from death so pronounced that it became his defining characteristic and his defining torment. And they all share this quality of unkillable, recurring existence. The emperor is a perpetual of a different order entirely. Where other perpetuals are remarkable, he is without comparison. His psychic strength alone, before any consideration of his other capabilities, would be enough to register as a minor deity in the warp, a presence so powerful that the entities who inhabit the Imperium instinctively recognize it as something fundamentally different from an ordinary human soul. And after spending thousands upon thousands of years accumulating power, studying the nature of the warp, watching the birth of the Chaos Gods themselves from a unique outside vantage, he arrived at the dawn of the Age of Darkness, the period of interstellar collapse known as the Age of Strife, ready to act on everything he had prepared. What he built is the thing we call the Imperium of mankind. In 30-odd years of the Great Crusade, using a force of warriors bred from his own genetic material, the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions they commanded, he reunited humanity across the stars. Thousands of worlds fell into his empire. Alien civilizations that threatened humanity were destroyed or driven back. The galaxy, for a brief and blazing moment, actually seemed to be getting better. There was a sense, in those years, of genuine possibility, of humanity reaching towards something worthy of itself. And then came Horus. And then came fire. The Horus Heresy is the defining catastrophe of Warhammer 40,000 lore, the event that every subsequent era of the setting is defined by and measured against. When his most beloved son, the War Master Horus Lupercal, was corrupted by the four powers of chaos and turned half the legions against the Emperor, the resulting civil war killed more human beings than any conflict before or since, save perhaps the wars of the universe's deep prehistory. Worlds burned, brothers killed brothers, Everything the Emperor had built came within a heartbeat of absolute destruction. It ended on the bridge of Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, in a confrontation that permanently changed the nature of the galaxy. Horus, filled with the power of all four chaos gods simultaneously, his will and his soul consumed by the darkest energies in creation, faced his father in single combat. The Emperor, refusing to use the full measure of his psychic power because he still loved his son even at that terrible moment and held on to the hope that there was something in Horus still worth saving, was destroyed. His body was shattered, his mind was torn open. Sanguinius, the angel, primarch of the Blood Angels, died on that ship before the final confrontation, breaking his wings on Horus's corruption and leaving his own death as a psychic key that the Emperor used in the final moments. And the Emperor killed Horus in his fury and his grief, burning the War Master's soul so completely that nothing could ever be reborn from it, not even in the warp. But the price he paid was everything. They brought his broken body back to Terra and laid it on the Golden Throne, a device he had been using for a different purpose entirely, as a gateway into the Webway, the Aeldari's ancient network of tunnels through space that he had been secretly expanding for human use. Now it became his life support system, his prison and his preservation, the machine that holds the last embers of the brightest fire humanity ever produced at the very edge of the line between life and death. The Golden Throne is approximately 4 miles in length and half a mile wide. Let that scale sit for a moment. This is not a chair. It is an engine the size of a small city district, buried beneath what was once Mount Everest, in the sublevels of the Imperial Palace on Terra, past the towering Eternity Gate and its twin Warhound-class Titan Guardians, past the Silver Door, into a chamber called the Sanctum Imperialis that most of the people who theoretically rule in the Emperor's name have never seen and never will. The machine is a relic of the Dark Age of technology, meaning it was constructed before the great collapse of human civilization, before the Age of Strife wiped out so much accumulated knowledge that entire fields of science had to be laboriously rediscovered. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars who maintain it, do so through ritual and rote rather than genuine engineering understanding. They can replace parts they recognize. They can perform the sacred maintenance rites passed down through 10,000 years of tradition. What they cannot do is truly repair it, because they do not understand its fundamental operating principles, and those principles are built into systems that have been slowly, relentlessly, inexorably degrading since the moment it was repurposed. Every year, the Golden Throne requires more to sustain what it sustains. The number of psychers sacrificed daily has risen over the millennia, a gradual creep that individually seems manageable but cumulatively represents an escalating crisis. The system logs failures with increasing frequency. Components degrade that cannot be adequately replaced. The machine is dying by degrees, and the Emperor within it is dying with it, and nobody who has the power to fix this situation actually knows how. The Mechanicus has tried. Their greatest minds have thrown themselves at the problem of the throne's degradation and come away with nothing, unable to make meaningful progress on a system that operates according to principles their theology does not permit them to properly investigate. But the Emperor is still there, not conscious the way you or I are conscious, not responsive to what happens in the physical world around him, not capable of speech or directed action in the material realm, but there. His mind exists in the warp in a way that defies easy categorization. He is not dead. He is not truly alive. He is something the galaxy has never encountered before, a being of almost incalculable psychic power suspended between existence and non-existence, and the light he projects from that terrible in-between state is the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is the psychic lighthouse of the Imperium, a beacon of such extraordinary power that it can be detected by trained navigators, those mutant humans bred over generations to perceive and navigate the tides of warp space across approximately 70,000 light-years. Without it, every starship in the Imperium is blind. Without it, faster-than-light travel becomes a desperate gamble in absolute darkness, ships emerging at random locations if they emerge at all, if they do not simply fall into the currents of the immaterium and never emerge anywhere at all. The entire economy of the Imperium, the military, the communication networks, The supply chains that keep hundreds of billions of people alive on worlds that cannot sustain themselves without regular shipments of food or medicine or manufactured goods. Every single aspect of imperial civilization depends on the Astronomicon functioning. And the Astronomicon exists because the Emperor exists. He calibrates it, focuses it, maintains its coherence through the force of his still active will. The sacrifice of 1,000 psychers each day feeds his strength just enough to keep the beacon burning at the intensity required for the navigators to see it across the vast distances involved. This is the foundation on which everything else in the 41st millennium is built. A dying god holding up a civilization too massive to sustain itself any other way, too committed to a structure that depends entirely on his continued existence to imagine functioning without him. When you understand that, you begin to understand why his return is not a simple matter of hope. It is one of the most complicated, most dangerous, most consequential events that could possibly occur. Number. Part 2. 10,000 Years of Silence. You might think, having heard all of that the people who run the Imperium would be absolutely desperate for the Emperor to recover, that they would throw every resource, every brilliant mind, every piece of knowledge accumulated over 10,000 years into the project of either restoring him to active consciousness or, failing that, finding a way to free him to regenerate as the perpetual he is and return in a new form. They have not done this. And the reasons why they have not done this are, depending on your perspective, either the greatest tragedy in the Warhammer 40,000 setting or the most darkly absurd institutional comedy in all of science fiction, and honestly, possibly both simultaneously. The Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium, the galaxy-spanning theocracy with its 10,000 worlds and its trillions of subjects, and its vast military apparatus grinding through perpetual war, is the exact opposite of what the Emperor wanted to build. This is not a minor irony or a footnote. It is the central, defining irony of the setting, the thing that gives Warhammer 40,000 its particular flavor of cosmic tragedy. He hated religion. He despised the worship of anything supernatural, including, explicitly, himself. He had a vision for humanity that was secular, scientifically advanced, guided by reason, and protected by warriors who served without demanding faith in return. He wanted a civilization that could stand on its own feet, that could meet the universe's challenges with intelligence and cooperation rather than superstition and hierarchical fear. What he got, in his absence, was a theocracy so rigid, so deeply entrenched, so absolutely certain of its own righteousness, that it prosecutes people for suggesting the Emperor might have been fallible. The imperial cult, the ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Ministorum with its vast hierarchy of cardinals and confessors and preachers, the Sisters of Battle, who are the ecclesiarchy's military arm and one of the finest fighting forces in the Imperium, the entire religious apparatus, has been built on the premise that the Emperor is a living God who watches over humanity from his golden throne and blesses the worthy and strikes down the faithless. This premise has given the ecclesiarchy enormous political power. The Cardinalate and the Ministorum control the spiritual lives of virtually every human being in the Imperium. They manage temples on every inhabited world, and armies of missionaries and tithes of extraordinary value, and the adjudication of questions that touch every aspect of human life, from birth to death. If the Emperor returned and said, as he almost certainly would, that none of this is what he intended, that the entire religious structure built on his name is an abomination that he finds philosophically repugnant, the ecclesiarchy ceases to exist as a meaningful power. The cardinals lose their authority. The Ministorum loses its income. An entire civilization-spanning institution, an institution that has spent 10,000 years becoming more entrenched and more powerful and more resistant to anything that threatens its position, simply stops having the foundation on which it built its authority. And institutions do not give up power easily, not even when the person their power was derived from is literally present in front of them. Beyond the ecclesiarchy, there is the matter of the High Lords of Terra, the council of 12 individuals who theoretically govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name. The Fabricator General of Mars, the Master of the Administratum, the Lord Commander Militant of the Imperial Guard, the Inquisitorial Representative, and the rest of this council have been the actual ruling body of the Imperium for 10 millennia. They make the decisions that matter. They determine which wars get resources and which do not, which worlds are deemed worth protecting and which are written off as acceptable losses, which technologies are authorized and which are suppressed as potential heresies. In practice, they are the Imperium's government, and their authority, though theoretically derived from the Emperor's own mandate, has long since taken on the weight of established fact. The Emperor returning and reclaiming active governance of his own empire would, at a stroke, reduce these 12 extraordinarily powerful individuals to administrators at best and ceremonial figureheads at worst. Some of them might welcome this, but the institutions they represent, institutions with their own internal politics and their own traditions and their own bureaucratic cultures that have been developing for 10,000 years, would not simply fold themselves quietly. Then there is the Adeptus Mechanicus and their relationship with technology. The Emperor's secular vision included active scientific progress, open research, the relentless accumulation and application of knowledge. The Mechanicus in the 41st millennium treats technology as religion. They classify innovation as potential heresy. They guard their technical secrets with a fanaticism that has actively prevented meaningful human scientific advancement for thousands of years, hoarding knowledge that could have saved billions of lives, denying it to anyone who has not navigated their Byzantine initiation hierarchies and accepted their theological framework. An emperor who saw this clearly and remembered what he had actually envisioned for human science would be a direct, existential threat to the Mechanicus's entire way of being. The Inquisition, the Adeptus Custodes, the Space Marine chapters, the civilian nobility of 100,000 worlds, all of them have built their power, their purpose, their identity, on the existing structure of the Imperium. Not all of them are wrong to do so. Many of them serve genuinely important functions, but all of them would face an existential challenge to their understanding of what they are and what they are for if the Emperor returned and began to actively govern. This is the situation his absence has created. A civilization perfectly optimized for a single purpose, which is maintaining itself, and deeply, structurally resistant to the kind of top-down transformation that his return would demand. This is not a small problem that his return would automatically solve. It is quite possibly the most difficult problem his return would create. Add to this the external situation, which is that, in the millennia since the Horus Heresy, humanity has faced threats on a scale that beggars the imagination. Tyrannid hive fleets from beyond the edge of the galaxy, organisms so vast and so numerous that they consume entire biospheres and leave nothing behind. Orc civilizations that organize themselves by magnetizing toward the strongest fighter, and then simply reproduce until they outnumber everything in the vicinity, their mass and their aggression scaling without apparent limit. Necron dynasties, waking from their millions of years' slumber in their tomb complexes across thousands of worlds, cold and ancient and utterly without sentiment, reclaiming territory that humanity has built cities on without a moment's concern for the people in those cities. Aeldari craftworld fleets threading the galaxy along paths human navigators cannot follow. Each craftworld a city ship carrying the last remnant of a civilization that once spanned the entire galaxy. The Imperium has survived all of this through sheer bloody-mindedness and the sacrifice of truly incomprehensible numbers of its own citizens. It has not flourished. It has endured, which in the 41st millennium is considered a form of success so extraordinary that entire cults have been built around the concept. The Emperor sits at the center of this suffering empire, and whether he is aware of what is happening around him is itself one of the great unanswered questions of the setting. Part 3. The Breaking Point. For centuries, the situation remained stable in the specific sense that it kept getting worse at a pace that was survivable. The Imperium lost worlds and fought wars and buried its dead in numbers that would have been genocidal catastrophes by any sane metric, but it held together. The Astronomicon burned. The black ships brought their harvest. The Golden Throne maintained its terrible vigil. And then, at the close of the 41st millennium, several things happened in such rapid succession that the galaxy effectively stopped being what it had been and became something fundamentally new. It started as so many catastrophes in the 41st millennium do, with Abaddon the Despoiler. Abaddon was once Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Luna Wolves, the Space Marine Legion most directly associated with Horus himself, the man who had stood at Horus's right hand during the Great Crusade, and who had arguably loved his Primarch more than any other member of that legion. When Horus was killed by the Emperor, when the dream of the heresy died on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Abaddon did not die, and he did not despair in the way that might have ended him. He retreated into the Eye of Terror, the great warp rift, born from the death of the Eldari civilization's soul, and he spent the next 10,000 years becoming something worse, something more patient and more purposeful than Horus had ever been. He launched 12 Black Crusades against the Imperium over that span of time, each one a devastating blow, each one calculated to probe, to test, to advance specific tactical and strategic goals that the Imperium's defenders could never quite see clearly enough to counter. He was learning the Imperium's weaknesses across millennia, the way you learn a wall's weaknesses by pressing against it repeatedly from different angles. His 13th Black Crusade was different from all the others. It brought everything, more traitor legions than had been fielded together since the heresy itself, daemon armies of a scale that had not been seen in the material realm in millennia, and the Blackstone fortresses, ancient weapons from before human memory that could direct warp energy as a physical force powerful enough to obliterate cities from orbit. Cadia was the Imperium's great fortress world, the sentinel of the Cadian Gate, the narrow safe passage between the Eye of Terror and the rest of the galaxy. For 10,000 years it had held. The Cadians were not simply soldiers. They were a people whose entire civilization, every man, woman, and child, was shaped by the constant pressure of knowing the Eye of Terror was right there, that the forces within it wanted to pour through their world and into the galaxy beyond. Cadians were born soldiers. They had genetic peculiarities from millennia of exposure to low-level warp energy that made them among the finest soldiers humanity produced. Their planetary defenses were the most extensive ever built, a testament to 10,000 years of unbroken vigilance. Abaddon broke it. He used the Blackstone fortresses to target the Cadian pylons, ancient Necron artifacts that had been built into Cadian soil in the era before humanity even existed. Their purpose was to dampen warp activity, to hold the Eye of Terror contained, to prevent its tides from expanding. Nobody in the Imperium fully understood what they were. They had simply always been there, incorporated into the planet's defenses as convenient high ground, used for centuries as military installations without anyone understanding their true function. When the pylons were destroyed, the Eye of Terror began to expand, and Cadia itself, despite everything its defenders could do, despite heroism of a degree that should have been impossible, was finally broken from orbit by the falling wreckage of a massive orc space hulk turned into a projectile. Cadia was gone, and in the aftermath, the Great Rift tore itself open across the galaxy. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Cursed Scar, stretches from the Eye of Terror in the galactic northwest to the Hadex Anomaly in the east, effectively cutting the Milky Way in half. On one side, the half that still includes Terra and Ultramar and most of the Imperium's major institutions, the Astronomicon, can still be seen. Warp travel is still possible. Life continues. That half is called Imperium Sanctus, the safe Imperium. On the other side, Imperium Nihilus, the dark Imperium. The light of the Astronomicon is gone. Ships that enter the warp on that side navigate in absolute darkness. Daemons pour through the breach in numbers that were previously impossible. Entire sectors have been cut off from reinforcement, from communication, from everything. Billions of people on thousands of worlds face whatever threatens them, with no realistic expectation that help will come. It was during this moment of absolute crisis, when the Imperium seemed to be finally reaching the end of its long endurance, that something extraordinary happened. Something that nobody had seriously expected. Something that changed the calculus of what was possible in the 41st millennium forever. A son came home. Number. Part 4. Signs and Miracles. Before we get to Guillemin's return, we need to discuss something that has been quietly happening for the entire length of the 41st millennium, something that most Imperial citizens never know about, and most Imperial authorities would rather suppress than examine too closely. The Emperor moves. Not physically, not in any way that can be directly measured or verified by conventional means. But the evidence is scattered across the lore like breadcrumbs from something too large to be entirely contained by its own supposed immobility. Consider the living saints. The Adeptus Ministorum has always catalogued its saints, holy figures whose devotion to the emperor was so profound that miracles were attributed to them in life and after death. That is within the expected range of religious tradition. But the living saints are a different category. These are individuals who have died, whose deaths have been witnessed and confirmed by multiple credible sources, who have then returned, not metaphorically, not as visions or inspirations or theological assertions about the afterlife. They return in their physical bodies, alive, and they bring with them psychic power of a kind that has no coherent explanation within standard imperial theology or military science, or any other framework the Imperium uses to categorize phenomena. Saint Celestine is the most famous example. She is a warrior woman who has been killed in battle a number of times that should make the concept of her continued existence a statistical impossibility. She falls. She returns, each time more luminous, each time apparently more powerful, each time surrounded by the golden light of something that everyone present recognizes as extraordinary, even if they cannot agree on what exactly it is. The ecclesiarchy calls this the Emperor's grace. The Inquisition calls it a matter worthy of extremely careful ongoing observation. The tech priests call it an anomaly in their data sets. What it actually represents, what the lore has been gradually suggesting across multiple sources over multiple editions, is the Emperor's will expressing itself through the warp, reaching through the medium of human faith to manifest in the material world when the need is great enough. The emissaries imperatus are another piece of this. These are members of the Adeptus Custodes, the golden warriors created to be the Emperor's personal household guard, who have been compelled by something they describe, consistently and clearly, as the Emperor's direct will to leave the walls of the imperial palace and go out into the galaxy. For thousands of years, these emissaries have appeared at critical moments, redirecting crusades, delivering messages that prove prescient, ensuring that specific things happen in specific ways that seem to serve some larger plan that nobody else can fully perceive. Their activity has increased dramatically in the wake of the Great Rift and the return of Guillemot, which is itself a kind of statement about escalating urgency. A custodian is not an ordinary servant of the Emperor. These are the warriors created to stand at his side, enhanced beyond even the extraordinary baseline of a space marine, trained for 10,000 years in the traditions and the purpose of direct personal service to the master of mankind. When a custodian says the Emperor's will compels them, the lore takes that seriously, in a way it does not take a random pilgrim's vision seriously. There is also the matter of the psychic awakening, the intensification of psychic phenomena across the entire galaxy that followed the opening of the Great Rift. The rift thinned the boundary between reality and the warp, in ways that dramatically increased the passage of psychic energy in both directions. Psychers across the galaxy have been manifesting abilities they did not previously possess. New psychic mutations are appearing in populations that had previously shown no such tendencies. And woven through this intensification, if you examine the accounts that Imperial scholars are quietly tracking in archives that are not widely accessible, are patterns that suggest something purposeful, not random. Not the chaotic outpouring of warp energy in all directions, without structure. Something that has a direction. Something that seems to be building toward a point. There is a line from a character named Mathieu, Guillemot's personal chaplain, discussing the opening of the Great Rift, that has proved more significant than its casual delivery might suggest. He makes the observation that the forces of chaos made a grave mistake by opening the rift, because in doing so, they have also empowered the Emperor and are accelerating his eventual return. Think about what that means. Chaos, in its arrogance and its certainty, assumed that splitting the galaxy and drowning half of it in the Imperium would hasten the Imperium's end. And it very nearly did. But the increase in warp energy flooding into real space, the thinning of the barrier between dimensions, the intensification of psychic power across the entire galaxy, all of this feeds something. And what it feeds, according to this fragment of lore, is him. He is not passive. He is not simply sustaining the Astronomicon and fighting his private war against daemon incursions in the warp while his empire burns around him. He is reaching, through the emissaries Imperatus, through the living saints, through the dreams of prophets and the visions of astropaths and the moments of inexplicable heroism that change the course of battles on worlds far from Terra. He is reaching toward some outcome that 10,000 years of physical immobility has not allowed him to express in any more direct way. The question of what that outcome is connects directly to the most consequential event in the modern timeline. Number. Part 5. The Return of Guilliman. The resurrection of Roboute Guilliman is, by any measure, one of the most significant events in the history of Warhammer 40,000, both as a fictional universe and as a commercial property that has been building its narrative for 4 decades. It represents the point at which Games Workshop committed, definitively and without the possibility of easy reversal, to actually advancing the story of the setting forward in meaningful and permanent ways. Guilliman was the Primarch of the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion. Where other Primarchs were warriors first and administrators a distant second, Guilliman was always a builder, an organizer. A man who understood that winning battles meant nothing if you could not sustain civilization in the spaces between battles. He had ruled his own interstellar empire, the 500 worlds of Ultramar, before the Emperor found him, and he had done so with a quality of governance that the Emperor explicitly recognized as remarkable. After the Horus heresy, when the Imperium was left bleeding and shattered, it was Guilliman who wrote the Codex Astartes and restructured the surviving Space Marine legions. It was Guilliman who rebuilt the shattered administration of the Imperium. It was Guilliman who held the thing together in the raw and burning aftermath of the heresy, when it might easily have simply dissolved. He was laid low at Thessala by his brother Fulgrim, already wholly corrupted by Slanesh, who drove a poisoned blade into Guilliman's throat. The wound was beyond the arts of any physician to cure, and Guilliman was entombed in a stasis field, his mortal body preserved at the moment of wounding, neither dying nor recovering, for the next 10,000 years. His resurrection required a genuinely extraordinary convergence of factors. Belisarius Cawl, a magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who had maintained continuity of consciousness across 10,000 years through technological augmentation and meticulous personal survival management, had been given a commission by Guilliman before the Primarch fell. He had spent 10 millennia completing that commission, creating the Primaris Space Marines, a new and enhanced lineage of Astartes built on Guilliman's own genetic template, and developing the means to potentially restore his Primarch if the opportunity arose. The opportunity arose after Cadia fell, when the Ynnari, the Eldari followers of the death god Yniad, offered an alliance and the use of their soul manipulation abilities. Celestine brought the intervention of whatever power sustains her impossible continued existence, and Cawl brought 10,000 years of preparation and the most sophisticated Medicae technology in human history. Together, they woke him up, and the galaxy changed. What happened immediately after his resurrection is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates everything that follows. Guilliman was taken to Terra, not to command or to fight, but first to do something he had not been able to do for 10,000 years. He went to see his father. He was allowed into the throne room. He stood before the golden throne and looked at what had become of the man he had followed and served and, in his way, loved. And what he saw broke something in him. Not his courage, not his will or his commitment to fighting for humanity. Something else, something harder to name, a certainty, a clarity that he had operated from before his wounding, a sense of what things meant and what they were for. He has never fully described what passed between them in that chamber, if anything passed at all. He has never said whether his father acknowledged his presence in any meaningful way. What he has said in the time since, in rare and unguarded moments recorded in Black Library fiction, is anguished and complicated and wrapped in the language of a man trying to hold himself together under a weight that should be impossible. He described himself as a man who had returned to find everything he built corrupted into something unrecognizable. He described the Imperium of his father as a rotting carcass, a machine of suffering, a lie sustained by sacrifices that had never been asked for by the people making them. In public, he has been the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the avenging sun returned to drive back the darkness. He has led the Indomitus Crusade, the most massive coordinated Imperial military operation since the Great Crusade itself, carrying Primaris reinforcements to beleaguered chapters across the galaxy. He has personally fought the Plague Wars against Mortarian's Death Guard in Ultramar, driving back the Daemon Primarch of Nurgle from the realm his brother created. He has been the commanding presence the Imperium desperately needed. But the private Guilliman, the one that surfaces in the fiction in unguarded moments, is haunted. He looks at the Imperium his father built and cannot reconcile it with what his father wanted. He wonders whether any of this was worth the cost. And what he cannot say out loud, what he perhaps cannot even fully articulate to himself, is the thing that matters most for everything we are discussing. Guilliman is not the Emperor. He is extraordinary. He is possibly the greatest administrator who ever lived, the most strategically gifted of all the Primarchs, a being of towering intelligence and iron will. But he is not what his father was. The changes he can make to the Imperium are real, but bounded by the very structure he is trying to reform from within. He can push, he can demand, he can put better people into positions of power, and remove the worst of the corrupt officials, but he cannot fundamentally remake 10,000 years of entrenched institutional rot by exercising political authority within those same institutions. What the Imperium may actually need is the one being whose authority supersedes every institution, every tradition, every established power structure simultaneously. The one being whose return would not merely reform the system, but render the question of which parts of the system to reform moot, because his word is literally the foundation on which all legitimate authority in the Imperium is built. The return of Guilliman is extraordinary. It may also be the first step in something far greater. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, I want to know. Drop a comment telling me your location and the time you are watching this. Late night, early morning, afternoon commute, whatever it is. I love knowing where this lore finds people. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe. There is a great deal more where this came from, and I promise it is worth your time. Number, Part 6, The Lion Wakes. 2 loyal Primarchs have returned within the span of a few years of in-universe time. The second was Lion L. Johnson, and his return arrived with a very different energy than Guilliman's, though it carries its own weight of significance. The Lion is the Primarch of the Dark Angels, the First Legion, and he is by any measure among the most extraordinary warriors the Emperor ever produced. If Guilliman was the architect and the administrator, the man who understood that victory is meaningless without a civilization to return home to, the Lion was something more primal. He was the hunter, the apex predator shaped in the forests of a death world into something that combined tactical genius with physical capability, so refined it crossed the line into something inhuman even by Primarch standards. He was raised on Caliban, a world that produced monsters, not metaphorical monsters, actual enormous predatory beasts, the great beasts of Caliban, creatures of nightmarish scale and ferocity that the planet's human population had been fighting for survival against since they first arrived. The Lion grew up hunting these things. He cleared an entire forest single-handedly as a child, a forest so vast and so dangerous that trained knights had been dying in it for years. He became the greatest monster hunter Caliban had ever seen, while he was still young enough that most Caliban children would still be under the protection of their families, and he did so through a combination of physical excellence and tactical thinking that simply had no peers. When the Emperor found him, he found a being who had already conquered his entire world through sheer force of will and martial excellence, who had unified the knightly orders of Caliban and given them purpose, who had been quietly and methodically building something that nobody else had thought to try. He was also, and this is relevant to the pattern we are discussing, the very first gene son the Emperor created before any of his brothers, the first Primarch. His story during the Horus Heresy was complicated in the specific way that everything connected to the Dark Angels is complicated. His legion was split between those who followed him into battle across the galaxy and those who remained on Caliban. And when Caliban itself was destroyed in the aftermath of the heresy, caught between the Lion's forces returning from war and the corrupted forces of Luther, the Lion's foster father and one-time greatest friend, the survivors of that destruction were scattered across time and space by the warp energies released. These became the fallen, the deepest shame, and the defining obsession of the Dark Angels, and all their successor chapters. The lion himself, after the fall of Caliban, was believed dead. He was actually hidden within the rock, the great mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels, in a stasis chamber known to very few individuals. He had been healing from wounds received in the confrontation with Luther, wounds that had been serious enough to require more than ordinary recovery. And the Emperor himself knew he was there, waiting, the lore implies, for the moment when he was needed. What woke him was the chaos of the Arks of Omen narrative, specifically the machinations of Vashtor the Archiphane, a demon prince whose schemes disturbed the rock's hidden chambers in ways that penetrated even to where the lion slept. He woke disoriented and alone, in a galaxy 10,000 years removed from everything he had known. And crucially, his first encounters were not with space marines, who recognized him. They were with ordinary people, civilians, men and women who had no idea who he was, who saw only a giant in battered armor emerging from somewhere, a stranger who might need help or might be dangerous, impossible to categorize. Something about that experience affected him in ways that the lore renders with unusual care. He spent time among people who did not know his name, who had no context for his legend, who related to him as a person rather than as a Primarch. He helped them with the immediate problems in front of them. He protected them when protection was needed. And in doing so, he was reminded of something he might have known once and lost in the long years of war. What the Imperium is actually for, who all of this sacrifice is meant to serve. He returned to his chapter and to the wider Imperium with something changed in him, not his capability, not his ferocity in battle, which remained exactly as ferocious as it had always been, demonstrated definitively in his confrontation with Angron, the Daemon Primarch of Khorne, a confrontation 10,000 years in the making that ended not through superior strength, but through superior intelligence. He fights with what the lore describes as a peculiar grace now, the hunter who has remembered that the hunt serves the village, that the monster killer's purpose is defined by the people the monsters would otherwise devour. Now there are 2 loyal Primarchs active in the galaxy, 2 out of 18 who survived the heresy in any meaningful form. And there are hints, carefully placed throughout the fiction and the game materials, that more may follow. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, is himself a perpetual, whose very nature is the ability to return from death. His whereabouts in the current era are unclear in ways that feel deliberate. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves departed into the Eye of Terror over 10,000 years ago, on an errand he said he would complete before the final battle, the exact nature of which the lore has always left tantalizingly undefined. Rogel Dorn, whose death has always been stated in the most deliberately ambiguous terms, whose chapter recovered only his hand from the site of his final battle, whose legion has never been comfortable fully accepting his absence. The stage is being arranged, the pieces are being moved with purpose, and at the center of it all, on his golden throne beneath the mountain that was once Everest, the Emperor waits for whatever it is he has been waiting for. Number, Part 7, The Star Child and the Perpetual King. Now we reach the theories. The deep lore, the speculation, the philosophical and narrative arguments about what the Emperor's return would actually look like and what form it would take. These are not idle speculation. They are grounded in specific lore developments that Games Workshop has put into the setting over decades, and understanding them changes how you think about the stakes involved. There are several distinct possibilities, each with different implications. The oldest and most established is called the Star Child theory, and it goes back to the very earliest editions of the game. The Star Child theory proposes that the Emperor's soul, or a significant and purified fragment of it, separated from his dying body during or after the confrontation with Horus, and has been gestating within the warp as a new and independent entity, separate from the decaying physical form on the Golden Throne. This fragment, in the theory, contains everything that was most essentially human about the Emperor, the parts of himself he deliberately shed during the heresy to become the pure instrument of destruction he needed to be in order to face Horus. The empathy, the warmth, the genuine care for humanity that he expressed in the early years of the Great Crusade, before the weight of what he was building consumed the man beneath the plan. The love for his sons that he was forced to set aside in order to do what he needed to do. The Star Child, in this framing, is a being of hope, a psychic entity growing in the warp that will eventually be powerful enough to either return to a new physical form or manifest directly in the material universe in a way that changes the fundamental nature of the conflict between humanity and chaos. In the early editions of the game, there was an entire faction, the Illuminati, dedicated to this theory. These were individuals who had been possessed by demons and survived the experience, gaining a unique resistance to chaos corruption as a result, who believed they could facilitate the Emperor's rebirth by gathering together the sensei, immortal children scattered across humanity who carry the Emperor's bloodline. This material was later deprioritized, treated as fringe belief, but the core idea never entirely went away. More recent lore has given us Euphrates Keeler, who appears in the Horus Heresy novel series as the first true saint of the imperial cult, a woman whose faith in the Emperor manifested as genuine psychic power at a time when such power should not have been available to an ordinary human being. The later Heresy novels treat her as something genuinely remarkable, a focal point of the Emperor's active will in the material world, a mortal vessel through which he can influence events in limited but meaningful ways. The lore strongly implies she is still alive in some form in the current era, still serving as a conduit for something that has been building across 10,000 years. Then there is the perpetual theory, which is the one that gets most directly at the practical mechanics of what could happen, and which is the darkest and most devastating irony in the setting, if true. The Emperor is a perpetual, that is confirmed lore. His nature means that he regenerates from death. He has done so before, across the thousands of years before the Great Crusade. The question is not whether he can regenerate, but whether the Golden Throne is preventing him from doing so. Consider the mechanism. A perpetual who dies fully, completely, triggers their regenerative ability and returns. But a perpetual who is kept at the edge of death, who is not quite dead because a machine is sustaining the minimum necessary biological function, cannot trigger that cycle. The threshold has not been crossed. The death has not occurred fully enough to release the regenerative mechanism. And the Golden Throne, which was built with every intention of preserving the Emperor's life, may be the thing trapping him in this in-between state indefinitely, holding him back from the death that would allow him to live again. This means that every person who has sacrificed their life to sustain the throne, every psyker consumed to keep the Astronomicon burning, may have been, with the absolute best intentions, participating in an act that prevents the very outcome they would want most. They are keeping him from dying so that he cannot live again. And they do not know this, because nobody with the authority to make the relevant decision and the knowledge to understand what they are actually deciding has ever been in a position to act on it. Because the alternative to maintaining the throne is genuinely terrifying. If the Emperor is released, if the throne is allowed to fail, and his regenerative ability does not trigger, or if it triggers too slowly, or if his soul is consumed by the chaos gods in the gap between death and rebirth, then the Astronomicon goes dark. The warp breach under the Imperial Palace tears open, Terra falls, and the Imperium of mankind likely ends within a generation. The downside of being wrong is not a political setback or an institutional disruption. It is the extinction of human civilization. This is the terrible calculus that nobody in the 41st millennium has been willing to face. And it may be one of the things that the return of Primarchs, of people who actually knew the Emperor, who remember what he was and what he intended, is moving toward resolving. There is one more possibility, and it is the most dramatic. The Emperor's continued existence on the throne, sustained by faith and sacrifice, sustained by the genuine psychic belief of trillions of worshippers across 1 million worlds, is causing him to become something. Faith in the warp has weight, it has presence. It creates entities. The chaos gods themselves were created by the collective psychic output of conscious beings over millions of years, fed by suffering and desire and ambition, until they had enough mass and coherence to become genuinely autonomous powers. The Emperor is fed by the faith of trillions of human beings who genuinely, sincerely, desperately believe he is a god. And this collective belief, channeled through the warp, is giving his presence in the Imperium a shape that is, increasingly, genuinely divine. He may already be a god. Not in the way that Khorne and Nurgle and Siench and Slaanesh are gods, not a thing built from corruption and the worst of what sentient beings can feel and do, but a genuine warp entity of immense power with a specific nature and a specific domain, something that has never existed before in the 41st millennium. And if that is true, then his return would not be the return of a man at all. It would be the descent of something new into the material world. And the question of what the galaxy looks like after that descent is one that no existing framework has the tools to answer. Number, Part 8. What changes when he returns? Let us be specific. Let us be concrete about what actually changes, faction by faction and institution by institution, if the Emperor returns in any of the forms the lore suggests are possible. Start with the most immediately disruptive, the religious crisis inside the Imperium. The imperial cult has spent 10,000 years building a specific and extraordinarily detailed theological understanding of the Emperor. He is omniscient. He watches over all of his faithful. He answers prayers. He works miracles through his saints. He guides the righteous and punishes the impure. He is perfect, infallible, the divine source of all legitimate authority, a being whose nature transcends ordinary existence in a way that makes him categorically different from the mortal leaders who serve in his name. The entire apparatus of the ecclesiarchy, every cardinal and confessor and preacher and battle sister, every cathedral on every world, every tithe paid in his name, every war declared in his name, depends on this framework being accurate. Now he comes back. Now he is here, physically present, actually capable of speech and action and expressed opinion. And one of the first things he says, based on everything we know about what he actually believed and what he actually wanted, is that the religion built on his name is a catastrophic misunderstanding of his intent, that he did not want to be worshipped, that he never authorized this, that the faith that sustained the Imperium through 10,000 years of darkness was, from his perspective, the wrong answer to the right question about what humanity needs to survive. This does not simply embarrass the ecclesiarchy. It existentially threatens every institution built on the premise of his divinity. What does a battle sister do when the Emperor himself tells her that her entire order was founded on a misunderstanding? What does a cardinal do when the being whose word is the foundation of his authority tells him he has no authority at all? What does an ordinary faithful citizen do when they learn the truth about what has been happening under the mountain? The psychological and social shockwave would be as destructive as any military campaign. Entire populations have organized their sense of meaning and moral purpose around the imperial faith. Billions of people have made decisions, sometimes irreversible ones, based on what they believed the Emperor wanted from them. The identity of those billions would need to be fundamentally renegotiated in a period of active war when identity and meaning and the sense of fighting for something are precisely the things that keep soldiers on the battlefield and civilians in the factories. But here's the complication that makes this not a simple matter of correction. He cannot simply declare the imperial cult heretical and shut it down, because the faith is real, the miracles are real. The warp does respond to human belief in ways that have genuine material consequences, and those consequences have been crucial to the Imperium's survival. The living saints are real. The power that sustains them is real. Whatever he is now, whether he is a god or something adjacent to a god, or something entirely new, the faith of trillions has made him into something that the simple secular rationalism of his pre-heresy vision did not fully account for. He wanted to show humanity how to stand on its own 2 feet. He may return to find that his own existence has made it impossible for humanity to stand any other way, and that the faith he never wanted has become the thing that gives his people the strength to face the darkness he spent his life fighting. Beyond religion, there is the question of governance. Guilliman has already demonstrated, through years of struggle as imperial regent, how resistant the Imperium's institutions are to reform even from the inside, even from someone with legitimate authority and extraordinary capability. The High Lords have been navigating around his directives, finding procedural ways to blunt his reforms, leveraging their entrenched positions against his outsiders' authority. He is a Primarch. He is the most politically gifted of all the Primarchs. And he still cannot force the system to change as fast as he knows it needs to change. The Emperor returning and reclaiming active governance would theoretically sweep all of this away. But theory and practice are different things. The machinery of imperial administration, the administratum, with its billions of clerks and its processes that have been running on autopilot for millennia, does not simply respond to the issuance of new orders from the top. Each layer of the hierarchy has its own culture, its own interpretation of its mandate, its own internal politics. The sheer logistical challenge of actually governing 1,000,000 worlds in a way that reflects a coherent central direction, rather than the accumulated inertia of 10,000 years of autonomous operation, is staggering, regardless of who is doing the governing. And the emperor would be doing this while simultaneously being the living disproof of 10,000 years of religious doctrine, while managing the political fallout of that revelation, while conducting a war against chaos that has not stopped for even a moment, while the Tyranids continue their approach, while the Necrons continue their awakening, while every other threat the galaxy can produce continues to press against the Imperium's borders. The Space Marine chapters add another dimension. 200+ chapters, each with their own traditions, and their own relationship with the worlds they protect, and their own interpretation of their mandate. All of them theoretically serve the Emperor. None of them are actually equipped to receive orders directly from him, because the system of oversight and command that Guilliman built after the heresy was explicitly designed to prevent any single authority, including a returning emperor, from having direct control over enough military force to repeat the catastrophe of the heresy from the other direction. The safeguards against a second Horus are also, necessarily, safeguards against the emperor himself. The practical challenge of translation, of taking the emperor's presumably vast and profound understanding of what went wrong and what needs to change, and converting it into policy that can be implemented across 1,000,000 worlds against institutional resistance. This is not a small problem. It is arguably the greatest organizational challenge in the history of any fictional universe, and it is the challenge that his return would immediately place at the center of the story. Number, Part 9. The Factions and Their Fear. One of the things that makes the Emperor's potential return so narratively rich is that it matters to every single faction in the setting, not just the Imperium. Every power in the galaxy has a stake in whether he returns, and most of them are, in their different ways, afraid. Begin with Chaos, because they are the most obvious and the most invested. The Chaos Gods and their servants have been working toward preventing the Emperor's return for 10,000 years. Every Black Crusade was partly about this. Every corruption of an imperial institution, every traitor Marine's campaign of devastation, every daemon's whispered temptation of a soul hovering on the edge, all of it serves the larger goal of keeping the Imperium weak and the Emperor contained within his throne, where he cannot threaten them. The Chaos Gods know, in the way that beings of immense malice and significant intelligence know things, that a returned Emperor is an existential threat to what they are. Chaos is powerful when it is opposed by something limited, by individual mortals, by human institutions fighting each other as often as they fight the real enemy, by a fire burning low on a golden throne, an emperor who is free and active in the material world, a being who has spent 10,000 years in the closest proximity to the immaterium that any material entity has ever achieved, would understand the nature of chaos in a way that no living enemy has ever managed. He would know their weaknesses, he would know their vanities and their rivalries, and the specific ways in which each of them is constrained by its own nature. He would know how to fight them, not just physically but psychically, at the level of fundamental metaphysics, where the real war is actually fought. The Chaos Gods have had 10,000 years of relative comfort in their dominion. The return of the Emperor would end that comfort in ways they cannot fully calculate and cannot afford to allow. This is why the Great Rift's opening, even as it served Chaos's immediate tactical goals, may have been a strategic mistake of enormous proportions. The warp energy, flooding into real space, empowers chaos, yes, but it also thins the boundary between dimensions in a way that a being of the Emperor's psychic power could potentially use. The chaos of the psychic awakening creates problems for the Imperium, yes, but it also creates a medium through which the Emperor's will can express itself more clearly than it has been able to in 10 millennia of containment. The Aeldari have a more nuanced relationship with the prospect. The Craftworlders, ancient and burdened by the weight of their civilization's catastrophic fall, understand better than any other species what it means when a civilization's collective psychic output creates something in the warp. They know exactly what Slaanesh is. They can see, through their Farseer's visions, what the Emperor is becoming. Some among them, particularly those whose visions extend far enough to see the approach of the Tyrannid hive fleets in their true scale, consider the Emperor's continued existence and potential return a necessary counterweight to forces that threaten everyone. The Ynnari, the Eldari followers of Ynnid, the death god, have a more active and more complicated interest. Their prophecies and their goals intersect with the possibility of the Emperor's transformation in ways that the lore has gestured toward without fully explaining. They helped resurrect Guilliman. They have aligned themselves with the Imperium's interests in ways that would have been unthinkable a century ago. The direction they are being drawn in, if you follow the threads of the narrative, points towards something that involves the Emperor's story in ways that have not yet been made explicit. The Necrons occupy a position of ancient authority and cold pragmatism that makes their reaction hardest to predict. The Silent King, Sarek, the ruler who led his entire species into the bargain with the Khaitan that saved them from biological death and enslaved them to metal bodies for 60 million years, has returned to the galaxy from a self-imposed exile with one specific goal: to unite the Necron dynasties against the Tyrannid threat. He views the Tyrannids as the most genuine existential crisis facing all life in the galaxy, the one threat that genuinely cannot be managed by any single faction or any alliance of convenience. He has, apparently, spoken with Guilliman. What passed between an ancient, undying god-king of an alien race 60 million years old and a 10,000-year-old Primarch who is, by Necron standards, practically newborn, the lore has not fully disclosed. But the fact of that conversation, the willingness of the Silent King to engage with the Imperium at all, is itself significant. If the Emperor returns in any form that changes the galactic balance of power substantially, the Necrons will need to decide where they stand. Some dynasties would view a more powerful and active Imperium as a threat to their own claims. Others might recognize that some threats require setting smaller conflicts aside. The Tau, young and pragmatic, and operating from the fringes of the galaxy's main conflicts, would likely find that a more functionally governed Imperium means more focused Imperial attention on their expansion. The Tau have grown in part because the Imperium is too consumed by wars on too many fronts to consistently prioritize suppressing a young species, that is, by the scale of galactic threats, relatively manageable. An emperor actively governing imperial strategy might look at the Tau's growing empire and make decisions about it. The Tyrannids, uniquely, may not care at all in any meaningful strategic sense. The hive mind does not process political events or respond to changes in governance. It responds to biomass and threat and the psychic signature of a galaxy's worth of life. The approach of the hive fleets continues regardless of what the Imperium does internally, indifferent to the identity of whoever is sitting on whatever throne. If the Emperor's return dramatically alters the galaxy's psychic landscape, the hive mind will adapt to that new landscape as it adapts to everything, without judgment, without strategy, beyond consumption. Inside the Imperium itself, the fear that runs through its own ranks at the prospect of the Emperor's return is its own complex thing. Not fear of his enemies, fear of what his return demands. Because 10,000 years of running an empire without the person who built it has given a lot of people a lot of invested interests in things staying as they are. The ecclesiarchy genuinely believes. The High Lords genuinely believe they are necessary. The various institutions genuinely believe their traditions matter, and that the Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium is terrible and cruel and wasteful and unjust, but it is also genuinely holding the line against forces that would be worse. The people inside it have usually found a way to make it work, to find meaning in its service, to believe that what they do matters. His return does not validate their service, it transforms it. And transformation, even necessary transformation, is frightening to people who have built their identities around what exists. Number Part 10. The Silence Breaks. We are in the middle of 2026, and Warhammer 40,000 has just entered its 11th edition, and something has changed in a way that deserves careful attention. Games Workshop broke a silence of 38 years. Since the franchise began in 1987, one of the foundational elements of the setting's particular power was the ambiguity surrounding the Emperor's actual state. Was he conscious? Was he aware? Was there a living being inside that rotting machine, or just the psychic residue of something that had already ended? The famous John Blanche illustration from 1987 captured something essential about this ambiguity: a triumphant emperor shown in official propaganda, while the real emperor rotted forgotten in the background. Nobody was supposed to know for certain. The ambiguity was the point. The horror of the setting was not the monsters. It was the possibility that the figure at the center of everything, the one whom 1 trillion people worshipped every day, might be nothing more than a beautiful lie. That ambiguity is now ending. The 11th edition lore has begun explicitly addressing the Emperor's state in ways that previous editions never did. The trajectory of the story being told across the game and the Black Library is pointing in a direction that the studio has, for the first time, stopped pretending it is not pointing in. Consider the pattern of the last several editions. At the end of 7th edition, Guilliman returned and the Great Rift opened, shattering the long stasis of the 41st millennium and launching the Era Indomitus. This was a fundamental change, the kind of change that previous generations of Warhammer 40,000 game design had considered impossible. The setting had been frozen in the final years of the 41st millennium for decades of real time, the same wars being fought on the same worlds in the same era, because advancing the timeline meant committing to a direction and potentially alienating players who had invested in the current state of things. They advanced anyway. At the end of 9th edition, the Lion woke. The Arcs of Omen narrative laid groundwork for developments that are still paying dividends in the current story, introducing plot threads that have not yet been fully resolved, and characters whose arcs clearly have further to go. The 11th edition launches against the backdrop of Armageddon, and Armageddon is significant in ways that go beyond the obvious. It is where some of the most brutal wars of attrition in the entire 41st millennium history were fought. It is where legends were made. Yarrick, the old soldier who became a symbol of human endurance by facing the greatest orc warlord ever born and simply refusing to stop fighting. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the Prophet of the Green, whose vision of a galaxy-spanning conflict of his own species against all others is the most coherent strategy any orc leader in history has ever attempted. The Blood Angels and their eternal struggle with the darkness inside their own gene seed. The framing of the new edition around Armageddon, around these legends being tested again in a new context, around characters who were supposedly dead, apparently being not quite as dead as everyone thought, is not accidental. Games Workshop tells its stories through the game itself as much as through prose. The choice of setting, the choice of which characters return, and which conflicts are highlighted, encodes narrative information. Yarrick was believed dead. He is apparently not entirely dead. The pattern of things that were supposed to be finished being revealed as unfinished has become a structural element of the current narrative moment. The Emperor has been waiting for 10,000 years. The lore has been building toward change for at least a decade of real time and many more years of in-universe development. Games Workshop has demonstrated, over multiple edition transitions, a willingness to do things that previous generations of the company considered impossible. They destroyed Cadia. They opened the Rift. They resurrected Primarchs. They have made the Indomitus Crusade a going concern that has genuinely altered the balance of power in the galaxy. What is the next impossibility? What is the move that would be as dramatic for this era of Warhammer as the destruction of Cadia was for the transition out of the 10th edition, the return of the Primarchs, plural, the sealing or transformation of the Great Rift, the resolution of the Tyrannid threat in some form, the Emperor? It is always the Emperor. The theories all have their merits, and their adherents, and their internal logic. The Starchild Rebirth offers the possibility of an Emperor who returns not as the calculating, magnificent, slightly inhuman being who built the heresy-era Imperium, but as something refined by 10,000 years of suffering and contemplation into something more complete. The Perpetual Death and Rebirth offers a clean, mechanical explanation grounded in established lore that does not require anything genuinely new, only the courage to let the established process complete. The God Ascension offers the most dramatically powerful option. An emperor who does not return as a man at all, but descends as something the galaxy has never had to account for before. Each of these changes the galaxy utterly. Each of them means a different kind of story going forward. Each of them resolves the central tension of the setting in a different way. And each of them is, frankly, exciting. Deeply, genuinely exciting as a prospect. Number, Part 11. The Cost of Waiting. There is something that does not get discussed enough in conversations about the Emperor's return, and it is this: the cost of not returning. Every day that the Emperor spends on the Golden Throne is a day that 1,000 psychically gifted human beings die to sustain him, not comfortably, not in their sleep. They are consumed, their life force drawn out, their brief and often extraordinarily gifted existence ended in service of the beacon that keeps the Imperium navigable. In 10,000 years, that is approximately 3.65 billion people, more than the current population of Earth, sacrificed to keep the lights on in a civilization that has never been able to agree on whether what it is doing is necessary or monstrous. This number is not an abstraction in the lore. The black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica move through the galaxy like dark birds, collecting psychers, bringing them to Terra. Every world with a significant psyker population knows the black ships. The families that watch their children be taken know what awaits them, in the vague way that people know things they have been trained not to think too clearly about. Some of the psychers themselves, the adults, with full awareness of their fate, go willingly. They believe, they choose. Some of them do not go willingly, but have no meaningful choice. And some of them are children. The Golden Throne is also failing in ways that have not yet fully manifested as crises, but are moving steadily in that direction across every source that addresses them. The machine is degrading. The Mechanicus's maintenance rituals are patches over cracks that deepen. The daily toll of psychers required has been rising, a gradual escalation that individually seems manageable, and in aggregate represents a trajectory that has a terminal point. The estimates that appear in various sources range from a few decades to a few centuries before the situation becomes genuinely unmanageable. Nobody knows the exact number. But the direction is clear, and has been clear for a long time. The Imperium is not waiting on an infinite timeline. The decision about what to do, whether to try to restore the Emperor, free him to regenerate, find some other solution, or simply maintain the current arrangement until it collapses, is not a decision that can be deferred forever. Every year of deferral makes the situation more urgent and the decision more dangerous. Every year the throne becomes a little less stable, and the consequences of any intervention a little more severe. Gilliman understands this. He does not say it publicly, because saying it publicly would generate a crisis of faith across the Imperium of a kind that could cause as much damage as the throne failing would. But he understands it. The emissaries Imperatus, moving through the galaxy with increasing urgency, suggest that something with awareness of this timeline is also aware that time is running out. The Primarchs who have returned are not just warriors. They are, collectively, the people who knew the Emperor best, who remember what he actually was before the throne, who understand the gap between what he intended and what exists. If more of them return, which the lore increasingly suggests is the direction things are moving, they become the nucleus of a group that collectively has the authority, the power, and the personal connection to make decisions that no one else in the Imperium is positioned to make. Decisions about the throne, decisions about what happens next. And behind all of it, in the golden dark beneath the mountain, something is still burning, burning lower than it should, burning at a cost that should not be sustained, but burning. And the question of what that fire becomes when it is finally free is the most important question in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. Number, Part 12. Why it matters that it hasn't happened yet. Here is the thing about a story building toward its greatest moment. The build-up is where the meaning accumulates. The reason the Emperor's return is such a powerful prospect is precisely and specifically because it has not happened yet. Because for 38 years of real-world time and 10,000 years of in-universe history, the Imperium has held itself together through sheer bloody sacrifice without the person it was built around. Because Guillemot returned and stood before his father, and came away from that encounter different, his certainty fractured, his grief visible, his purpose complicated in ways that make him more human and more interesting, and ultimately more capable of doing what needs to be done. Because the lion woke up and spent time among ordinary people and allowed himself to be reminded of what it was all for. Every Primarch who returns adds to the weight of what was lost and the weight of what needs to be recovered. Every miracle attributed to the Emperor is a breadcrumb in a trail that leads somewhere specific. Every year that the Golden Throne holds together is a year that the story has to develop the consequence that will make the moment of resolution actually mean something when it comes. The people at Games Workshop know this. They have been developing this narrative with a deliberateness that becomes more evident with each passing year. The decision to advance the timeline, to let Cadia fall, to let the rift open, to bring back Primarchs, these were not small decisions, and they were not made without awareness of the risks. When you advance a story, you commit to a direction. You make things happen that cannot be undone. You open the door to failure as well as success. They advanced anyway. The stage is being arranged. Primarchs are returning. The rift is open, and its consequences are rippling through every corner of the galaxy. The throne is failing, and the clock is running. The lore is gathering speed, pulling towards something that every piece of it seems to be pointing at. Whatever form the Emperor's return takes, it will carry the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated sacrifice and suffering and hope. Every person who died for the throne, every soldier who fell on a world the Emperor may never know existed, every prayer whispered in the darkness by someone who needed to believe something was listening. The moment of return, if it comes, will not happen in isolation. It will happen at the end of a story this long, and every piece of that story will be in the room when it does. There is a throne in the darkness beneath the world, and on that throne sits a God who cannot speak. But perhaps, his silence is almost over. Some things in the lore are worth sitting with slowly, in the quiet hours. This is one of them. If you have a theory about what his return looks like, about which form it takes, about what the galaxy looks like in the first weeks and months after it happens, share it in the comments. I read all of them. I think about a lot of them long after the conversation ends. If this is your first time spending time with this channel and this kind of deep lore, welcome. If you enjoy sitting with these questions the way I do, there is a lot more of this waiting for you. Hit subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes. Until next time, take care of yourselves. The Emperor protects. End of script. Number. Extended analysis. The architecture of hope. There is a way of looking at the Warhammer 40,000 setting that focuses exclusively on its horror, its darkness, the relentlessness of the war, and the cruelty of the institutions and the scale of the suffering. That reading is valid. The grimdark is real. It is built into the bones of the fiction. It is part of why the setting resonates with people in a way that more optimistic science fiction sometimes does not. Life in the 41st millennium is genuinely terrible for the vast majority of people living it, and the lore does not shy away from that. But there is another reading, and it runs underneath the horror like a current in deep water. The 41st millennium is terrible, yes, and yet the Astronomicon still burns. And yet the Imperium, for all its corruption and cruelty and institutional rot, continues to resist the forces that would make things actively worse. And yet people in the fiction find courage, find love, find moments of genuine connection and genuine heroism, not in spite of the darkness, but in the middle of it. This counterpoint, this stubborn refusal of meaning and hope to be entirely extinguished even in the worst circumstances, is the Emperor's legacy, not the Golden Throne, not the Inquisition or the Space Marines or the vast machinery of imperial civilization. The fact that human beings in the 41st millennium can still choose courage when they don't have to, can still sacrifice for strangers, can still decide that something matters enough to fight for it, even when the fight seems impossible. The Emperor planted that, not through grand gestures or divine intervention, but through the example of what he was, a being who had every reason to despair about the nature of his species, who had watched humanity fail itself across all of recorded history, and who chose anyway to believe that it was worth fighting for, who spent 10,000 years before the Great Crusade building toward a future that he could not guarantee, investing in a species that had disappointed him 100 times, because the alternative was to allow the darkness to win by default. That choice, that refusal to accept that things cannot be better, is the most essentially human thing about him. It is what makes his potential return not just a military event, or a political event, or a religious event, but a moral event. A statement, in the most definitive possible terms, about what he believes humanity is capable of becoming. When people discuss the Emperor's return, they often frame it in terms of power. What armies would he command? What political authority would he exercise? How would the Chaos Gods respond to an active and free Emperor, rather than a contained and diminishing one? These are legitimate questions and important ones. But the deeper question is the one about meaning, because the Emperor returning does not just change the balance of power in the galaxy, it changes what the galaxy means. It is an answer, finally, to the question that 10,000 years of the Imperium's suffering has been asking without knowing how to ask it. Was it worth it? Was all of this endurance, all of this sacrifice, all of these billions of deaths in service of a flame that never quite went out, was any of it leading anywhere? His return would be the answer that none of the institutions of the Imperium can give, because they are all too invested in the current state of things to see past it. It would be the answer from the person who started it, who built it, who understood what it was for, in ways that 10,000 years of institutional sclerosis have obscured. The answer, if his return is anything like what the lore suggests it could be, would be yes. Yes, it was worth it. Yes, it was going somewhere. And now, finally, we arrive. That is why this story matters so much to the people who love this universe. Not just as gaming narrative, or commercial product, or fan speculation, though it is all of those things. It matters because it is, at its core, a story about whether hope is justified when the evidence against it is overwhelming. About whether it is rational to fight for a future you cannot guarantee against forces that have every apparent advantage. The Emperor's answer, built into the very fact that the Astronomicon still burns, and the throne still holds, and his sons are returning one by one to a galaxy that desperately needs them, is that hope is not just justified. Hope is the only strategy that has ever actually worked. Number. Extended analysis. The mechanics of return. Let us spend some time with the practical mechanics of what a return might look like, because the lore actually provides several distinct scenarios, and each of them has different implications. The first and most straightforward scenario is the one tied to the Golden Throne's degradation. If the throne fails catastrophically, faster than anyone can respond to, the Emperor dies completely and his perpetual nature triggers. He is reborn somewhere, in some form, stripped of the physical continuity of his old body, but carrying the consciousness and the accumulated 10,000 years of whatever he has been experiencing in the warp. He returns young, in whatever mortal form his regeneration produces, without immediate access to the political authority of the Emperor of mankind, without an army, without the physical trappings of his former self. This scenario is in some ways the most dramatically interesting, because it requires him to rebuild from nothing, an emperor who has to convince people of who he is rather than simply being recognized and obeyed. An emperor who might spend years or decades working his way back to a position of authority while the institutions that grew in his absence resist him at every turn. This is the scenario most like the Messiah myth, that the setting deliberately echoes, the returned savior who is not recognized by the world he comes to save, who has to earn his place again even though he built that place in the first place. The second scenario is more controlled and more terrifying in its own way. The Primarchs, or some subset of them, in consultation with the Adeptus Custodes and whoever else has the necessary authority and knowledge, make a deliberate decision about the throne. They choose to allow it to fail in a controlled way, or they find some means of triggering the Emperor's death without the catastrophic collapse of the Astronomicon, perhaps by having a contingency in place, perhaps by working with the Aeldari's understanding of soul energy, to bridge the gap, perhaps through means the lore has not yet revealed. They accept the risk because the alternative, allowing the throne to fail on its own terms, is a guaranteed catastrophe rather than a calculated one. This scenario requires the people around the throne to make the hardest decision anyone in the setting has ever had to make. To kill the Emperor deliberately, knowing that if they are wrong, the Imperium ends. To trust his nature as a perpetual. To have faith, ironically, in the science of what he is, rather than in the theology of what he has become. There is a profound and dark poetry in the idea that the people most committed to the Emperor's survival might be required to choose his death in order to allow his return. The third scenario is the one that changes the nature of the setting most fundamentally, and it involves no death and no rebirth at all. In this scenario, the Emperor does not return as a physical being. Instead, he completes the transformation that the lore has been gesturing toward, becoming fully and genuinely divine in the warp, a fifth great power of the Imperium, built not from humanity's worst impulses, but from its best ones: hope, courage, sacrifice, the stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be rational. He becomes a god of the human ideal rather than the human failure. In this scenario, what returns to the material universe is not a man stepping off a throne, but the direct and unmistakable presence of something that has never existed before in the galaxy's history. Miracles become not rare anomalies, but a consistent feature of reality where faith is present. The Astronomicon does not go dark because it is no longer the Emperor sustaining it, but the Emperor in a new and more powerful form. The war against chaos does not end because gods do not end things, they define them. But the terms of that war change in ways that chaos cannot simply overwhelm with numbers. The ecclesiarchy, in this scenario, is vindicated in the strangest possible way. They were wrong about almost everything they believed about the Emperor, but they were right about the most important thing. He is a god, not the god they described. Not the omniscient, judgmental, specifically interested deity of their theology, but genuinely, actually, meaningfully divine, in a way that has material consequences for anyone who reaches toward him in faith. Each of these scenarios has its adherents in the fan community, and each of them has lore support. None of them is clearly ruled out by the current state of the setting. Games Workshop has not committed to a direction, which is both frustrating for people who want to know what happens and narratively correct, because the story is not over yet, and the direction it takes when it arrives matters. What is worth noting is that all three scenarios require something that the current state of the Imperium cannot produce on its own: the willingness to let go of what exists in favor of what could be. The Primarchs who have returned are the most credible candidates for that willingness, because they are the only people in the setting who knew the Emperor before the throne, and who know him now in his diminished and changed form. They are the ones who can look at the gap between what he was and what he has become, and see both the tragedy and the possibility in that gap. This is why their return matters so much, not just militarily, not just because two of the most powerful warriors in the galaxy are now active and fighting for the Imperium again, but because they are the living embodiment of the before. The memory of what was possible and their presence in the current era creates pressure toward making something possible again. Number, extended analysis, parallel stories, and reflected themes. One of the things that makes the Emperor's story so resonant across different readers and different approaches to the lore is the way it mirrors real histories and real mythologies without becoming a simple allegory for any of them. The most obvious parallel is the dying god myth, the archetype of the sacred king who sacrifices himself for his people and whose death sustains them. This pattern appears in dozens of cultures and traditions, and the Emperor fits it exactly. He sacrificed himself, in the only way available to him, to stop the catastrophe that was consuming his civilization. His death, or near death, became the thing that sustained the civilization he was dying to protect. His followers built a religion around his sacrifice, and the promise of his return, the hope that he will come back when he is needed most, is the thread of light running through 10,000 years of darkness. But Warhammer 40,000 is too smart to simply be a retelling of the dying god myth. It complicates it. The religion built around the Emperor's sacrifice is not the thing he would have wanted. The prayers offered to him are not what he asked for. The faith that sustains millions of people through terrible circumstances is, from his own perspective, a misunderstanding built on a foundation of ignorance. The mythology got it wrong, or got it right, in ways it did not intend, and the gap between the myth and the reality is where most of the setting's interesting tension lies. The Emperor is also, in some readings, a figure for the kind of leader who is exactly what a crisis needs, and exactly the wrong thing for the peace that follows. He was magnificent as a wartime leader, as the builder of an empire from nothing, as the man who could hold together an alliance of extraordinary beings and drive it toward an impossible goal. But his relationship with his sons was complicated by his secrecy and his long-term planning, and his inability to simply tell people the truth about what he was doing and why. The heresy, in some analyses, was not primarily caused by chaos corruption, but by the failures of a leader who trusted too little and explained too little and kept too many secrets from the people who needed to understand what they were fighting for. A returned emperor would need to be different from the emperor who sat on that throne, and the lore implies that he knows this. The long years of contemplation in the warp, watching the consequences of his decisions play out over 10,000 years, experiencing the love and the faith and the suffering of the people who serve in his name have had to change him. The emperor who returns will not be the same being who placed himself on the golden throne. He will carry 10,000 years of perspective that he did not have before, and that perspective may have given him exactly the things he was missing: humility about the limits of planning, understanding of what his people need from him beyond military direction, the capacity to tell the truth about difficult things rather than managing information strategically. Or he may return damaged in ways the setting has not yet explored. 10,000 years of dying but not dying, of existing in the space between life and death, of being sustained by sacrifice and faith from people he never consented to be worshipped by, could produce something other than wisdom. It could produce trauma of an order that no existing therapeutic or theological framework is equipped to address. It could produce anger at the chaos gods who created the situation, at his sons who let the heresy happen, at himself for the failures of planning and communication that contributed to everything that followed. A returned emperor who is angry is a different kind of story than a returned emperor who is wise. And the setting is honest enough, I think, to not automatically assume that the most powerful being humanity has ever produced will handle 10,000 years of suffering in the most psychologically healthy possible way. Number. Extended analysis. The other sons. We have talked about Guilliman and the lion, but the Emperor had 20 Primarchs in total, and the question of what the others are doing and what their role in his return might be is its own area of rich speculation. Of the 9 who remained loyal during the heresy, the current status is as follows. Guilliman is active and leading the Imperium as Imperial Regent. The Lion is active and fighting in the current era. Vulcan is a perpetual, whose return seems almost inevitable, and whose exact current location the lore has not pinned down. Lemon Russ departed into the Eye of Terror, on an errand he said he would complete before the final battle, a statement that has been hanging in the lore for decades, waiting to be resolved. Rogel Dorn's death has always been stated in the most deliberately ambiguous terms possible. Jagatai Khan disappeared into the Webway, chasing a Dark Eldar fleet, and the Webway has not given him back. But the Webway is a place where time and space operate differently, and the Khan was never a man to stay lost if he didn't want to be. Corvus Corax underwent a transformation in the wake of the heresy that moved him in a direction different from the others. Sanguinius is dead, genuinely and completely dead, but his gene sons, the Blood Angels, carry his legacy and his psychic shadow in ways that the lore continues to develop. The Khan is lost in the Webway, and the fate of several others is genuinely unresolved. The 9 who fell to chaos are a different matter. Several of them have returned as Daemon Primarchs, empowered by their chaos gods, beyond their already extraordinary baseline. Mortarion, Daemon Primarch of Nurgle, has been fighting a sustained campaign against Ultramar that Guilliman has been fighting back. Magnus the Red, Daemon Primarch of Tsiench, continues to pursue his own agendas in the Eye of Terror and beyond. Angron, Daemon Primarch of Khorne, was recently defeated by the Lion in the current narrative, though defeated is probably too strong a word for something like Angron, who is sustained by his Chaos God and will presumably return. Fulgrim, who stabbed Guilliman and turned himself into a Daemon Prince of Slaanesh, continues to exist. Perturabo, Lorgar, Alfarius, or Omegon, all of them are out there somewhere, their current activities not always visible to the Imperium, but always potentially relevant. The implication of several loyal Primarchs returning is that Games Workshop is building towards something that requires multiple sons of the Emperor to be present and active. The narrative logic of the situation points toward a final confrontation of some kind, not between individual warriors, but between what the Emperor represents and what the Chaos Gods represent, fought on multiple fronts simultaneously by his sons, who embody different aspects of the human potential he was trying to build toward. A returned Emperor leading that confrontation, with Guilliman managing the political and logistical dimensions, and the Lion leading the military campaign, and Vulcan providing the endurance that his perpetual nature embodies, and Russ providing the ferocity that the final push will require. This is the shape of a story that the lore has been building toward. It is not guaranteed. It is not certain to happen in this form, but it is the direction that everything points. And at the center of it, the Golden Throne, and in the center of the throne, whatever remains of the greatest being humanity ever produced, burning low, burning lower, waiting. Number. Extended analysis, the weight of 10,000 years. Let us close by talking about something that often gets lost in the grand strategic discussions about return and consequence. What those 10,000 years have actually meant for the people living through them. The 41st millennium is not just a setting. It is an accumulation of human history of a kind that beggars the imagination. Every world that has ever been settled by the Imperium has its own history, its own wars, its own generations of people who were born and lived and died in service of something they mostly did not fully understand. Every Space Marine chapter has a history measured in centuries or millennia. Every great institution, the Ecclesiarchy and the Mechanicus and the Inquisition and all the rest, has its own internal story of how it became what it is, what compromises were made, what ideals were preserved, and which were lost along the way. The Emperor returning does not erase that history. It cannot. 10,000 years of a civilization developing in a specific direction, with specific consequences, with specific people shaped by specific experiences. This is not a slate that can be wiped clean by even the most powerful being in the galaxy descending from a golden throne. The history is real. The people shaped by it are real. The problems it has created are real, and will not be solved simply by the return of the person who built the civilization that created them. This is, perhaps, the most mature thing about the Warhammer 40,000 setting's handling of this question. It does not suggest that the Emperor's return solves everything. It suggests that his return changes the conditions within which everything else must be solved, and that the solutions will still require the work of human beings, of communities, of institutions choosing to do better than their history suggests they know how to do. The Imperium is not going to become the secular, scientifically progressive, culturally rich civilization the Emperor originally envisioned, simply because he comes back. The damage done is too extensive, the institutional habits too deeply embedded, the people too shaped by the world they live in to simply become different people because the circumstances change. What his return offers is not a solution, but a direction, a clearer sense of what is being fought for and why. A leader whose authority is not derived from tradition or appointment, but from the actual original source of all of it. And sometimes, in the worst circumstances, a direction is enough. A sense that the fight is going somewhere, that the sacrifice has a point, that the darkness is not simply endless, but is being pushed back by something that will eventually prevail. Sometimes that is the thing that makes the difference between people who endure and people who give up. The Emperor, even on the throne, even silent and diminished and seemingly unable to act, has been giving the Imperium that direction for 10,000 years, through the Astronomicon that guides their ships, through the living saints who demonstrate that his power is still real, through the emissaries imperatus who arrive at the right moment and say the right thing, through the accumulated faith of trillions of people who reach toward him and, sometimes, feel something reach back. His return, if it comes, will be the moment when that direction becomes unambiguous, when the thing that has been felt and hoped for and prayed toward for 10 millennia arrives in a form that can be seen and heard and engaged with directly. And every person who has ever prayed in the dark and waited for an answer will have their answer. Not the one they expected, almost certainly not the one the Ecclesiarchy prepared them for, but real, present, here. The Emperor, finally, coming home. That is where this story lives, right at the edge of something. For people who have loved this universe for years, the feeling of standing at that edge, of knowing that the narrative is building towards something without knowing exactly what, is one of the most extraordinary things in fiction. I am glad to spend time at that edge with you. If you want to share your thoughts on where you think this goes, the comments are yours. If you want to know when the next deep dive into this universe happens, subscribing is the way to do that. Every piece of this lore deserves the time and the care that it takes to do it properly, and that is what this channel is for. Until the next one, take care of yourselves. The Emperor protects. End of extended script. Number. Extended analysis. The warp, the soul, and the nature of divine power. To fully appreciate what the Emperor's return would mean for the 41st millennium, it helps to understand how the warp actually works, what it is, and why the Emperor's relationship to it is unlike anything else in the setting. The warp, the Imperium, the great ocean of the soul, this is not simply another dimension in the science fiction sense of an alternate physical space with different natural laws. It is something more specific and more philosophically interesting than that. The warp is the psychic reflection of the material universe. Every conscious being in the material realm generates psychic energy as a byproduct of thought and emotion, and that energy flows into the warp, takes shape there, accumulates. The warp is not an empty space that psychic energy travels through. It is made of psychic energy. It is what collective consciousness looks like when you give it dimensionality and presence. This means that the warp is, in a meaningful sense, what all of us together dream into existence. The monsters that dwell in it are not alien invasions from another universe. They are the reflection of what we feel and what we fear and what we want, given autonomous form by the sheer mass of similar feeling across enough minds over enough time. The Chaos Gods are the extreme of this. Entities so vast and so powerful that they are, in practical terms, indistinguishable from gods, because they are built from the sum of everything an entire galaxy's worth of conscious beings have ever felt about the domains they embody. Khorne is every act of violence ever committed, distilled into a pure principle. Nurgle is every acceptance of decay, every quiet making peace with death, every grandfather who smiles at the end of a long life, twisted through a billion deaths into something monstrous. Tzeentch is every plan, every hope, every manipulation of reality toward desired outcomes, taken to its logical extreme. Slaanesh is every sensation and every desire, pursued beyond the point of wisdom. The Emperor, before the Golden Throne, was already operating on a scale that most beings in the material universe cannot comprehend. His psychic presence in the warp was, even in mortal life, the equivalent of a second sun in a space of otherwise flickering candles. He had spent thousands of years developing a relationship with the warp that was fundamentally different from the way other psychers relate to it, not a user of psychic power, but something more like a native of the Imperium who had chosen to also exist in the material world. The Chaos Gods recognized him as the anathema, the thing most fundamentally opposed to their existence, not because he was physically powerful enough to destroy them, but because what he represents as a conceptual entity is the direct negation of what they are. Where they are built from humanity's worst and most destructive impulses, the Emperor represents humanity's best, not in a saccharine or naive way. He is not simply a symbol of goodness and light in a darkness versus light narrative. He is the embodiment of what humanity is capable of when it chooses deliberately and consistently to be more than its worst impulses. The capacity for reason over passion, the capacity for sacrifice over self-preservation when the sacrifice serves something genuinely worth more than the individual self, the capacity for hope in circumstances that make hope seem irrational. On the Golden Throne, fed by the faith of trillions, and existing in the warp in a state that blurs the boundary between mortal existence and something else entirely, the Emperor has been becoming something for 10,000 years. The warp shapes itself around what inhabits it. A being of the Emperor's psychic magnitude, sustained by that quantity of genuine faith over that span of time, cannot remain what it was. The warp is making him into something new, something appropriate to the faith that sustains him, in the same way that the Chaos Gods are appropriate to the fear and desire and violence that sustains them. What emerges from that process is not predictable from first principles. The emperor before the throne was already beyond ordinary human comprehension. What 10,000 years of immersion in the warp has made him into is a genuine unknown, even within the lore, even to the characters who think about it most carefully. The Aeldari Farseers, who have glimpsed the shape of his presence in the Imperium, have come away from those experiences shaken in ways that they do not easily discuss. The Daemon princes who have encountered the edges of his sphere in the warp have generally retreated rather than engage with it. The Chaos Gods themselves, who are the oldest and most powerful entities in the warp, who have been playing their great game for millions of years, and who have never yet encountered something they could not eventually corrupt or destroy, treat his presence in the Imperium with a caution that is, by Chaos God standards, practically respectful. What that suggests about what he is becoming is left as an exercise for the reader, but it suggests that whatever it is not smaller than what he was. It is not weaker. The 10,000 years of suffering on the throne have not diminished him. They have transformed him into something that the Chaos Gods, who are not afraid of anything, are careful about. If and when he returns to full presence in the material universe, in whatever form that takes, the Chaos Gods will face something they have not faced in 10,000 years. Direct opposition from an entity that has been specifically shaped by the same mechanism that shaped them, the collective psychic output of humanity, but pointed in the opposite direction, not toward entropy or sensation or manipulation or violence, toward something that can actually win. Number. Extended analysis, the question of consent, and the weight of the ecclesiarchy. One of the aspects of the Emperor's story that does not always receive the attention it deserves is the question of whether any of this was done with the consent of the people involved. And I do not mean the Psyker's sacrifice to the throne, whose lack of meaningful consent is obvious and acknowledged. I mean the broader question of whether the religion built on the Emperor's name, the entire structure of the imperial cult, is something that humanity chose, or something that happened to humanity while it was too desperate and too frightened to choose otherwise. The answer is complicated in ways that are worth sitting with. The imperial cult did not emerge from a deliberate conspiracy to create a false religion. It emerged from the genuine experience of people who had survived the Horus Heresy and found themselves in a galaxy that was suddenly, terrifyingly more dangerous than it had been before. They had seen, or heard credible accounts of, genuinely miraculous things. The Emperor had performed acts during the Great Crusade that defied any secular explanation. His presence had tangible effects on the people around him. The living saints, even in those early days, were real. The miracles were real, and in the raw aftermath of the heresy, with their civilization shattered and their most powerful leaders dead or scattered, people needed to believe that something was still watching over them. The faith came from a real place. It came from genuine experience of something that could not be easily explained in secular terms, from the genuine psychic reality of a being whose power extends into the emotional and spiritual fabric of reality, from the legitimate observation that when people call on the Emperor in their darkest moments, sometimes something answers. The institutions that grew around that faith are a different matter. The ecclesiarchy's political power, its wealth, its armies, its control over the spiritual lives of trillions of people, this emerged from the same process by which any religious institution becomes a powerful political entity, the slow accumulation of authority over questions of meaning and legitimacy, combined with the institutional self-interest that all large organizations eventually develop. The Ministorum did not set out to become a corrupt political machine. It became one because that is what institutions do when they are not regularly challenged and reformed. An emperor who returns would need to navigate this distinction carefully. The faith of ordinary people, the genuine experience of a mother on a distant world who prays for her children and feels, sometimes, that she is heard. This is real and it is good, and it is the soil from which something genuinely valuable has grown, even in the midst of the Imperium's dysfunction. What is not good is the institutional apparatus built on top of that faith to extract resources and maintain power. Gilliman has attempted, carefully and with full awareness of how explosive the situation is, to reform the ecclesiarchy's worst excesses. He has had limited success. The institution is too entrenched, too wealthy, too politically connected, across 1,000,000 worlds for any individual authority to fundamentally restructure it in a short period. But he has established that reform is possible without the collapse of faith itself, and that matters. An emperor who returns, if he is wise, will understand that the faith of his people is not the problem. It is the institutional exploitation of that faith that needs to be addressed, and addressing it in a way that does not destroy the genuine spiritual experience of billions of people who have organized their lives around a real relationship with something real. This is one of the most delicate tasks in the entire setting. It requires a kind of wisdom and a kind of empathy that the Emperor of the Great Crusade era may not have fully possessed. The man who was willing to raise a Space Marine chapter's homeworld because they were worshipping him was, in some respects, right about the principle, but catastrophically wrong about the method. The institution of the word-bearers required correction. Burning Kur was not that correction. It was the act of a being who had not yet learned that humans need their beliefs acknowledged even when those beliefs need to be changed, who had not yet understood that you cannot correct a mistake by making an equal mistake in the opposite direction. 10,000 years of watching his people live and die by the faith he never authorized may have taught him that lesson. Or it may not have. The story does not tell us yet. And the answer to that question matters enormously for what his return would look like in practice. Number. Extended analysis, mirrors, and precedents. The Ynnari and the potential alliance. There is a story happening in the Warhammer 40,000 universe right now, in the current era of the setting, that has not received the full attention it deserves, and it involves one of the most surprising developments in the history of the franchise: genuine cooperation between humanity and the Eldari. The Ynnari are the followers of Yniad, the Eldari god of the dead. Yniad's existence is one of the most interesting pieces of metaphysics in the setting. When the last Eldari soul is consumed by Slaanesh, the accumulated death energy that is built up in the Eldari pantheon's spiritual sphere is supposed to coalesce into a new deity of sufficient power to challenge Slaanesh and potentially free the captured Eldari souls. The Ynnari are those Eldari who have committed to hastening this process, believing that Ynid, partially awakened by the birth of the Great Rift, can be brought to full power without requiring the death of the last Eldari. What makes this relevant to the Emperor's return is what the Ynnari have already done and what they seem to be building toward. They helped resurrect Guilliman. They have aligned themselves with the Imperium's interests in ways that would have been literally incomprehensible 100 years earlier in the timeline. And the lore surrounding them, the prophecies and visions that drive them, increasingly involves not just Yniad, but the Emperor, the presence in the warp that the Eldari have been studying and watching for 10,000 years. The Eldari are the oldest starfaring civilization still meaningfully active in the galaxy, with the possible exception of the Necrons. They have been studying the warp longer than humanity has existed as a species. They understand its metaphysics, with a sophistication that human psychers are only beginning to approach. And they have been watching the Emperor's presence in the warp for 10,000 years, with the specific perspective of people who created a chaos god themselves and know exactly what that process looks like. What they see when they look at the Emperor's presence in the Imperium is, according to fragments of lore, deeply familiar. They have seen this before: the gathering of faith energy into a divine form, the slow crystallization of a psychic entity around a core of powerful belief. They did it with their own civilization's emotional output and created Slaanesh with catastrophic consequences. They have been watching humanity do something similar with the Emperor, and the question of whether it will end the same way or differently is one that haunts Eldari theological discussion. The difference, as the Eldari see it, is intent. Slaanesh was not created intentionally. It emerged from the accumulated excess of a civilization that was not trying to create a god and was not prepared for the consequences of doing so inadvertently. The Emperor, by contrast, is a being who understands what the warp is, who has been managing his relationship with the Imperium deliberately for thousands of years, who had specific goals and specific methods and a specific understanding of what he was trying to avoid. Whether that intentionality is enough to produce a fundamentally different outcome is the question. Whether the Emperor becoming divine in the warp produces something that serves humanity rather than consuming it is the thing that every farseer who has turned their attention to this question has been trying to determine for generations. The Ynnari's alignment with the Imperium, their willingness to help resurrect Guilliman and to engage with Imperial military campaigns, suggests that at least some of the Eldari have reached a tentative answer. And that answer is that the Emperor's trajectory in the warp is something they want to support rather than oppose, because what it appears to be building toward is something that is, for the first time in Eldari experience, not another source of devastation for all conscious life. This potential alliance, fragile and tentative and complicated by 10,000 years of mutual distrust and genuine conflict, is one of the most hopeful things happening in the current era of the setting. It suggests that the Emperor's return, in whatever form it takes, may not be something that humanity faces alone. It may be the beginning of something genuinely new in the galaxy's history. Different species, with different interests and different histories, choosing to stand together against a common darkness because they have collectively arrived at the understanding that the common darkness is the actual enemy. These analyses could continue for hours, because that is the nature of this universe and this lore. The Emperor's story touches everything in Warhammer 40,000, which means that pulling on any thread of it leads to more threads, more connections, more implications that are worth exploring. That is the mark of genuinely great world building, the sense that the world keeps going even when you are not looking at it, that the questions it raises open into more questions rather than closing into simple answers. That is what we have here, and it is why this is worth coming back to, again and again, as the story develops and the additions advance and the narrative builds toward whatever it is building toward. The Emperor waits, the galaxy turns around him, and somewhere in the darkness beneath a mountain that used to be Everest, something that might be hope is still burning.